Some games out there have really great graphics, but just terrible gameplay. On the flip side, there are a bunch of games out there with quote-unquote bad graphics that are actually a ton of fun to play. Today we got 20 examples we're going to talk about. Now, keep in mind, bad graphics is kind of subjective. It's really just different art styles. So let's get started off with number 20. The first one is BattleBit Remastered. Now, this may look like a Minecraft mod, but this game is a legit alternative to the Battlefield games. It was like made by a couple of guys who just wanted to bring back that kind of Battlefield experience that they liked. This game makes up for the bare bones visuals with just rock solid kick-ass online multiplayer. Up to 254 players can be in a single server at the same time, leading to some pretty huge battles. There's destructible environments, a full set of vehicles, more than 20 maps. It's a massive game that was clearly made by people who very much love Battlefield and understand how a game like that should play, with some smart improvements to the formula too. Honestly, for a multiplayer shooter, having more basic, less visually busy maps actually makes the game feel a lot more fair, a little bit more reasonable. It's easier to distinguish enemies and, immediately tell what's going on. It doesn't need this big invasive HUD with tons of markers all over the place and big glossy graphics. No, this is just core gameplay down to its roots. It's made by a small team, and the amount of active players is a lot smaller now than when the game first launched back in 2023, but there are still enough people playing to keep some servers full. There has been some development stakes and some development communication that isn't always the best, but it's still a cheap and fun Battlefield alternative, and who cares what it looks like? Next, over at number 19, we're gonna get some people pissed off, Fallout New Vegas. Now, even though this came out about 2 years after Fallout 3, in some ways, it actually looks worse than Fallout 3. A lot of the time, the graphics look like they came from like a weird messed up Fallout 3 mod or something. Now, this is, don't get it twisted, it's still probably the best modern Fallout game, but the graphics, especially back at the time of release, did it no favors. Everything else about the game is almost universally an incredible improvement on Fallout 3, though. Well, other than the bugs. The shooting feels better with the ability to use iron sights, the writing is significantly better, the quest design is awesome, interesting, compelling, some of the best that the series has ever seen. There are so many ways to express your character through dialogue and take different options for certain quests that lead to some very different endings. The new reputation system made the game feel more reactive and more interesting. Just in general, it's a much better RPG than Fallout 3. We're not saying Fallout 3 is bad, and some people will always prefer that one more, but Fallout New Vegas is beloved by many for a reason. It looks pretty rough a lot of the time. On console, the frame rate was a disaster, but the world is so interesting and the writing is so good that it doesn't matter. You like that? Next, over at number 18, from its oversized and poorly designed UI to the low poly, kind of gaudy looking stages, Cruelty Squad is a game that's meant to make you feel uncomfortable. Now, rather than being an ugly game out of just bare bones necessity, like BattleBit, Cruelty Squad is a game that's gloriously ugly just out of design. The developers wanted the game to look like this. They wanted to make players feel uncomfortable and a little sick, and to their credit, they succeeded with flying colors because, I mean, look at this. It's one of those games where it's honestly kind of hard to tell what you're even looking at. It's a mission-based FPS that's highly difficult. It doesn't take many shots to kill you, so playing carefully and tactically is important, but it's kind of difficult when you can barely even tell where you are, what you're supposed to be doing, or even how much health you have. The giant green glob in the corner is your health, and a little eyeball pops up when someone sees you. It all looks like idiotic chaos, but there's actually some tactical depth here. There's a lot of different guns and equipments you can bring into a mission. You can sneak in or go in guns blazing. There are lethal and non-lethal options. There's just a lot of stuff you could do in this, and that includes using your guts as a swing, and also eating corpses for health. There's also an in-game stock exchange, because why not? Look, Cruelty Squad is a disgusting, bizarre, and weird game. It's absolutely hideous. But with this, there's an art to it. It's so ugly that you can't help but be impressed, and that's more the point of this list. Next, over number 17, we have Valheim. Now, this open world survival game has a lot of positives going for it, like the satisfying progression and the easy to use building mechanics, but it has to be said that the game can look old. The world and models are low polygon, everything has this like sickly shininess to it. It's a sort of weird mix of intentionally low fidelity textures and crazy intense after effects. Sometimes it looks amazing, it has moments where it doesn't look that great. But to be totally honest, with this one, I think it actually looks pretty cool. Again, games that are technically ugly or have bad graphics can be pretty subjective, and I like the style that Valheim really went for here. It's simple, it's a little bit unique, and believe it or not, so many survival games have these massive, bloated file sizes and the games still look ugly and jacked up, but Valheim here is actually well optimized and made, and while that might seem like small praise, it's a big deal if you're a PC gamer with limited hard drive space or just not the best machine. This is a cheap game, the survival stuff is challenging, the world is intriguing to explore, the sandbox elements are great, it's really good with friends. Valheim is just awesome, and it's got some charmingly lo-fi graphics. Next, over at number 16, this viral indie project, Vampire Survivors, is ridiculously fun and addictive. It was one of my favorite games the year it released. I really was shouting from the rooftops about this one, but I mean, like, when you look at it, it does look like a very lo-fi, almost like student project. The sprites barely even move or animate. They have a walk cycle, kind of, and that's it. It's like an almost unbelievably basic looking game, but the developers used all the tricks they learned as a mobile game developer to create a game that felt good to play and constantly give you hits of dopamine to keep the player invested. It would feel sinister in a free-to-play game where they're trying to get you into buying microtransactions and stuff, but Vampire Survivors is like just a flat couple of bucks and you get everything you could ever want. It's just a straight-up game. Now, a lot of other games have tried to do this lo-fi, kind of really basic style, and this style of gameplay, but I don't feel like any of them really top Vampire Survivors. It's easy enough to pick up and play, there's just enough complications to keep you engaged, and the constant unlocks mean it doesn't feel like your time is wasted. There's always some new character to play as, or some new alternative map to try out. It's a simple, unpretentious game that's so much fun to play, despite it looking bare bones. Next, over at number 15, Salt and Sanctuary. This is one of the first Souls-inspired Metroidvanias, and it's probably still one of the best, in gameplay at least. The graphics are kind of sketchy. They're often muddy and kind of undefined, and the paper doll style animation isn't for everyone, but everything else about this game is absolutely solid. Keep in mind too, this came out before Hollow Knight. but in terms of scale, it's pretty comparable. It's got the giant, sprawling, side-scrolling world of a Metroidvania game, but with the stamina-based combat of a Souls game. Playing cautiously is essential because, you could die really quick. There's a lot of platforming, way more than your average Souls game, but otherwise, it manages to capture the dark fantasy style pretty well, even if the actual visuals are divisive. We don't really mind how the game looks, but we have seen some people say it looks ugly and cheap. It's not visually lush, it's monochromatic, but hey, it's what they do. It's what they go for. These guys clearly get the Souls games. For a while, this was by far the best out there, and it remains one of the best games in its genre. This is a good one. You just gotta get past the graphics, and honestly, it's not gonna be that hard to do so. Next, over at number 14, Dragon Age Origins. This was released in late 2010, and this game is like a classic, but it's also kind of ugly. The textures, even then, were muddy, the character models are stiff, the armor is kind of goofy looking, the environments look barren and lifeless. It's a kind of bleak and ugly looking game, and compared to BioWare's other game from 2010, Mass Effect 2, Dragon Age looks like a game from a different generation. Now, it's not the graphics that make this game though, it's the gameplay. As an RPG, it's fantastic. There are so many different ways you can approach situations or resolve stories that have a huge effect on how the story plays out. The origins of the title is still one of BioWare's best ideas, where depending on the class and race you pick at the start, the prologue chapter will play out completely differently. Dragon Age, of course, has gone on to do many things at this point, but this one felt humble, just kind of like an old school CRPG back before we had like Baldur's Gate 3 blow everybody away. I still love this one the most. I don't know if that's an unpopular opinion. Now over at number 13, RimWorld. This colony sim has very simple, abstracted visuals that are reminiscent of games like Prison Architect, but the actual simulation going on behind the scenes is so much more complicated. The basic visuals are kind of a means to an end, because if they actually showed everything that was going on in this game, it would have been the most expensive video game ever made. I don't even know how they would do it. The basic experience of playing RimWorld is kind of like a much more deadly version of The Sims. It's a playground for storytelling, but with like a much more sadistic streak to everything. At least, if that's how you choose to play it. At the most basic level, it's a survival and management sim, but each colonist has their own inner life that you don't have any direct control over. Left to their own devices, these colonists will bicker with each other, get into fights, fall in love, all kinds of things. And depending on your scenario, things can get pretty weird. The potential for cruelty is kind of through the roof too. This is could be one of the most depraved and evil games if you really want it to be. The graphics are basic, like we said, but they serve the game well. It's not an impressive looking game, but the stories you can tell or create while using it are amazing. Next, over at number 12, God Hand. This PS2 cult classic from Capcom may not stand out to you. It might look like another PS2 game, but look at some of the other games that had come out recently. Resident Evil 4 came out a year earlier, and also from Capcom. Even though God Hand was sold as a budget game, there was a baseline expectation when it came to Capcom, and this game visually did not meet that. Here's the thing, God Hand, for some of us here, it's an all-time great, but it's not the best looking game, not even from the time. The levels were basic, boxy, and barren, especially at the start, Later levels were a little bit more visually interesting, but the game was mostly just kind of average, bordering on overly simplistic. Even the main characters lacked detail, or at least compared to what people had come to expect at the time. It shouldn't have mattered back then, and it doesn't matter now, because playing the game is great. It's a lot of fun. The tank controls take some getting used to, but the combat is just brilliantly designed and challenging and creative. The difficulty level scaling was one of its most interesting features, where like if you performed well and avoided attacks and stuff, then the difficulty gauge would keep going up, making things harder. While if you took damage and struggled against enemies, then that gauge will go down. For most people, that gauge is going to be low because this game is really tough, but it's a satisfying experience that doesn't really go on too long. It was kind of like the hi-fi rush of its day, except that game visually looked gorgeous. God Hand does not. Next, over at number 11, let's talk Nidhogg and Nidhogg 2. Two awesome, ugly games for the price of one here. The first game was ugly in the ways you'd expect. It's like a retro thing. But the second game was not. Now, the original Nidhogg was a multiplayer sensation. It was simple, but it had a lot of depth. This is one-on-one multiplayer, like where you're just kind of swashbuckling with a sword. You had multiple different sword stances to take. Each would deflect the other, and your goal was to get to one end of the map, and it only takes one hit to kill you, but respawns are quick, so there's like this constant push and pull back and forth. Mind games and stuff, strategies, to really make it a fresh, fun game that's approachable. It's easy to pick up and play. But the graphics were not winning any awards. Like I said, they were pretty retro, really as basic as it gets. It looks that way because it was the most straightforward way to depict what the player needed to see. The sequel looks better, technically at least. I don't even know how to describe the ugly-ass art style of the second game. It's intentionally hideous, and it's really funny. It's so off-putting visually that many people who love the first game just did not want to play the sequel. But I mean, come on, it's awesome. I know it is not what a lot of people wanted, and I know some people just don't like ugly, cartoony style, but that's what we got here, and it's still so much fun to play. Next down at number 10, oh boy, it's Demon's Souls. Let's be honest here. From Software made a lot of ugly games prior to hitting it big with Dark Souls. They made some ugly games after that too, but their ugliest game in the series is still the one that started it all, Demon's Souls. The gameplay was revolutionary. The atmosphere was second to none, but graphically, Demon's Souls just wasn't really that impressive. There's a lot of ugly, barren parts of the game. There's stuff that's graphically inconsistent, muddy, flat looking. There are many parts that look like they came straight out of a PS2 game. Now, don't get me wrong, it's an ugly game, but that ugliness gives it a real atmosphere in a weird way. In some ways, the PS5 remaster or remake, whatever you want to call it, which technically looks so much better in every way, just wasn't able to really recreate that magic feel of the original PS3 Demon's Souls. Now, Dark Souls also had some ugly as hell stuff in it, and Dark Souls 2, I think, was kind of worse. But I think what makes Demon's Souls so interesting is how experimental and new it really was. It was kind of ugly, but it somehow worked. Art direction went a longer way, the atmosphere really helped it out, and it really overall as a game, it holds up way better than a lot of others. Next over at number 9, Jimmy and the Pulsating Mass. Now, there are a lot of lo-fi indie RPGs out there, like, I don't know, Undertale, but with a game like that, you can tell there's a talented artist behind the artwork in those games. They're not good-looking games when it comes to visual detail or complex artwork or like ray tracing or anything like that, but they're going for something different and it works. But this game, on the other hand, just feels weird. I don't know what's going on here. I know part of this is meant to be intentional, and there's no part of the game where they wow you with some unexpected art upgrade. The game just is what it is the whole way through. That being a big homage to Earthbound, another game with fairly basic visuals, but had a whole lot more creativity. Jimmy has that in spades. Even though this one is inspired, it looks kind of weird, but it has more mechanically rich stuff going on compared to a lot of other indie RPG throwbacks. It's actually a well-designed and pretty challenging game with amusing dialogue. It's almost like a video game outsider art, but it's all just a little too competent for that kind of title. This is a weird game with bad art, but that somehow works. Now down at number 8, we have Dusk. Dusk, I mean, look at it. It's got low resolution textures, extremely low polygon weapon models and enemies. Things look muddy, everything is dark or brown, but it doesn't matter. It is absolutely awesome. You could technically say Dusk has quote-unquote bad graphics, but it's not an ugly game. They were going for something here. They were going for like a Quake or like a throwback to a bunch of PC games, and the aesthetics are spot on here. It's grungy and dirty in the most perfect ways. The sloppiness of like the texture looks and the vaguely human-shaped enemies give the game a unique art style that really just like works. It's got atmosphere for days. And the gameplay is excellent too, dude. Like, as one of the first major retro throwback shooters from the 2010s, Dusk was hard-hitting, brutal, and satisfying. The amount of control you have, the amount of feedback you get, everything was awesome. So nothing else really matters here. Let's move on. Next over at number 7, GeneForge 2 and the games of Spiderweb Software. Now, we're putting GeneForge 2 in the title simply because it's the most recent game to come from Jeff Vogel and Spiderweb Software. But really, any game in their long library would do, mostly because they all pretty much look the same. These games have bare bones visuals, to put it mildly. The remasters look simple and barren, and the originals are even worse. But there's a reason why Spiderweb has been chugging along all these years, and that's because they make damn good games. These are old school RPGs through and through, with player-made characters and parties and stats and quests and all the stuff you'd really expect from one of these games. What makes them unique is the quality of writing and the reliable and engaging game mechanics. There's nothing mind-blowing here, but the mechanics are consistently solid. The most interesting of these games is the GeneForge series, where you're basically a Pokemon master who commands monsters. All their games are great, even if graphics are nothing to write home about. It's the design of the worlds, the writing, and mechanics that keeps players coming back. Next over at number 6, Hotline Miami. This is another one of those like intentionally abrasive looking games. The pixel graphics are kind of chunky, the colors are intentionally garish, and the whole thing has this rough, gritty look to it to make it look like it was like made by somebody in a manic episode. The whole game feels like a bad come down. It's meant to be strange and disorienting. Nothing really makes much sense. And even though there's kind of a story here, it's just a bizarre game. The presentation is wild, but the gameplay is excellent. This is like one of the best games ever made, in my opinion. Each level is split into small areas where you need to clear out enemies. One shot is instant death, so you need to be tactical and aggressive to survive. Most of the time, it takes multiple deaths over and over and over again to get through a checkpoint, but it's so satisfying. And the music is incredible, too. The graphics and the presentation, it really just feels like it's designed to make you sick, make you feel like you're on drugs. But when the music is hitting, when the violence and the gore is really hitting, and the gameplay clicks, it's one of the best things ever. Next, over at number 5, it's Pizza Tower. Take even the best Microsoft Paint artwork, and sure, it's technically impressive, but like it's still MS Paint. It looks weird, and that's Pizza Tower. This frantic, Wario-inspired platformer tries to be as ugly as possible with its bizarre paint graphics and garish colors. Everything looks like it was drawn freehand as quickly as possible in MS Paint, but like it's like in a sloppy and intentional way. Of course, the guy who made it worked on this for months, so this is not some cheap cash-in. This is the intentional style. And it's ugly, and we love it. This game has the kind of like manic energy right out of a 90s cartoon combined with like YouTube poop. It's total chaos. But they really hit that sweet spot, and none of it would really matter if the gameplay was bad, which it isn't. It's a lot of fun to play. The movement powers are pretty tightly designed. The simple act of moving around the levels feels great, and it's a big reason why speedrunning this game is so popular. Pizza Tower is awesome. Now, next over at number 4, Kenshi. This is one of the most unique and bizarre games out there. It's an open world RPG without any real goals. There's no world destroying plot to stop. You're just dropped into this world, and it's up to you to survive. Most of the time, you won't. You'll get ambushed by a huge gang, you'll get beat up, you'll get sold into slavery, or just left for dead. You can hire allies, increase your reputation with various factions, you can build like entire settlements, and eventually become a major power player in this world. You don't have to though. You can just roll around with a gang and see what happens. Most of the time you die, but not always. Sometimes you just lose a limb. Now, as you can tell, it's not the most visually impressive game. It looks like an MMO from the very early 2000s, but it's one of the most unique and interesting games on Steam. Now down at number 3, Deus Ex, the original one. It's one of the all-time greats. It's a legendary game that was highly praised back when it came out and has earned only more accolades since. But even back in the year 2000, we all recognized that it wasn't really the best looking game. Unreal had come out a few years earlier. Half-Life had already come out at this point. It was not wowing anyone with its graphics back then. What Deus Ex did have was a great RPG system and branching dialogue and side quests. You could tackle missions in so many different ways. You could talk your way out of situations, you could get into shootouts, or be stealthy. And all of these options were totally viable. It's something that's pretty common in games this day and age, but the way Deus Ex handled this is still really impressive. Sure, the environments are totally barren, and the character models barely animate and look really goofy, but the gameplay was top-notch and really revolutionary for the time. Now down at number 2, Steven's Sausage Roll. The graphics are ugly and simplistic, the name is silly, and the Steam description tells you nothing. But the absurdly named Steven's Sausage Roll is considered like one of the best puzzle games of all time by some. It starts off basic. All you have to do is like take a sausage and then put it on the grill, but each mission adds more complex layers to this thing until the game morphs into something totally different. There are no explanations for new puzzle elements. You just have to figure things out on your own. In terms of puzzle design alone, a lot of people consider this to be really awesome. That's how good the gameplay is. So don't let the extremely simple 3D graphics confuse you. This game is legit. Now down at number 1, there are bad graphics, and then there's Dwarf Fortress. For most of its existence, the game didn't even have graphics. It just used what it could to give the vague approximation of what you're supposed to be seeing on screen, but without spending a lot of time with the game, it just looks like a jumbled mess of symbols. Now, with the game out on Steam, there is an actual visual layer to everything. It's still very basic, but at least you can clearly see things like walls and beds. It's not much, but it's so much more than what it used to be. It's nice that we can actually see the Dwarven colony a little better, so more people have the opportunity to really experience this ridiculously complex simulation that is Dwarf Fortress. It's a colony game similar to RimWorld, with the simulation taken to the next level. That's what this game's two-man development team has been doing for all these years, adding more and more simulated elements to the world. The entire history of the world is simulated at startup. Kingdoms rise and fall and rise again before you even start. The simulations here are so intense that it leads to all kinds of bizarre things happening, like the famous drunk cats story. Cats were getting mysteriously drunk in-game, and after some digging, the developers realized they were getting drunk from walking around in taverns. Dwarves would drink, which would create puddles of beer on the floor. Cats would walk through them, which would then get beer on their paws, and then the cats would lick their paws and get drunk. That's just one of the many, many unexpected or weird things that can happen in this game, just because what they built is so complex. It's so complex, but the graphics are nothing special. Clearly, it's out of necessity. Doesn't matter. All the stuff going on behind the scenes are what makes Dwarf Fortress such a remarkable and legendary game. But like we said, those are 20 games with quote-unquote bad graphics that have great gameplay or just really fun to play for a variety of reasons. Like I said, we covered a lot here. Intentionally bad graphics, amateur graphics, just kind of like underfunded, under budget graphics, all kinds of stuff. If you got any other examples, let us know in the comments. Of course, there is a good conversation to be had here because some of this, like I said, is subjective, but doesn't matter. Let's talk about this stuff. And if you like this video and you like talking games with us every day, clicking the like button's all you got to do. It really helps us. And if you're new, maybe consider subscribing because we put out videos every single day. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.